If you want to get a very high grade on a very important test, how do you go about studying for it? And if you want to understand a topic really, really deeply, how do you go about studying for that? A few years ago, researchers in Turkey asked these very questions to a group of students preparing for the all-important college entrance examination. But before I tell you what they found out, I want you to look at these 6 study strategies. Which ones would you use to prepare for a big standardized test, and which ones would you use to understand a topic more deeply? When researchers asked students how they were preparing for this big exam, and this was for the section in physics, they answered with some of these kinds of strategies. Answering as many test questions as possible, repeating what is learned in class, going over examples in the test booklets so that they can understand test-taking strategies, memorizing formulas. But when the researchers asked students about the advice they would give to someone else who wasn't taking this exam, but who wanted to understand the topic very differently, they gave a different set of strategies. Doing experiments and making observations related to the topic. Relating physics to everyday life. Understanding the logic behind the formulas. Understanding concepts and the relationships that concepts have to each other. Now, I think there are 2 important conclusions from this research. One is that students know what good studying looks like. At least this group of students do. They know some effective strategies for learning a topic very deeply. But the problem is that the test seems to be getting in the way. The test seems to be incentivizing them to study in a more shallow way, so that ironically they are less prepared for a college physics program by taking the college entrance exam than they would be through just not taking the standardized exam and trying to learn the physics really, really deeply. But there's more. This phenomenon is consistent with other findings. First, it's consistent with how schools and teachers react to standardized testing. So in the States, at least, schools and teachers can be rewarded or punished depending on how well their students do on their standardized exams. This leads to a lot of focus on test-taking strategies and teaching to the test, and an increasingly large portion of the year spent on specifically doing well on the test, rather than, say, learning the material as a whole more deeply. It also leads to things like cheating and fraud from time to time. Second, it's also consistent with research on performance and mastery goals. Now, I'm going to make a longer video about performance and mastery goals in the future, but briefly, having a performance goal is kind of like wanting to perform really well on a test, right? You want to have a certain skill level at a certain time. You want to get a really good grade in the class. Having a mastery goal is more like wanting to understand something very deeply. Now, the tendency in this large area of research is for students who have mastery goals to learn something more effectively than students who just have performance goals. It's not 100% of the time, but it certainly is the majority of the time. There are, however, some limitations to the study. So one, it took place in Turkey, so how widespread is this phenomenon? I don't see any reason why it wouldn't apply to other countries, but it's an open question. The other thing is that this was a group of elite students at an elite high school. It's possible that it wouldn't apply in other contexts, although again, I can't really think of a good reason why it wouldn't. One of the larger limitations is that it's based on self-reports. So we don't know exactly if students were reporting their own study strategies accurately. We also don't know if removing the test from the whole situation would improve students' study habits. This wasn't an experimental manipulation here. The researchers were not the dictator of Turkey. They can't just do that and see what happens. It certainly raises a question about the potential harm that standardized testing can have on the learning habits of students. And whatever your perspective is, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about whether you think, hey, this is a widespread phenomenon that happens all the time, or maybe it's kind of limited to certain circumstances, or maybe you just disagree with the claims in the study. And one more thing, didn't I just make a video about how awesome tests were for learning? Yes, I did. In that video, I argued in favor of testing and that testing can be a very powerful way of improving learning outcomes. So what's the deal here? Tests can have a lot of different impacts depending on how they're designed, how they're used, how they're interpreted and implemented. And so in an upcoming video, I'm going to talk about how to design tests in a way to get the benefits that I talked about in that video without the drawbacks that I talked about in this one. That's it. That's the whole argument. Click the like button if you like the video and subscribe if you want to see that next upcoming video about tests.